Hello, welcome to the first lecture of Questions in Philosophy. As I start on the question of what is real, let me make one point that perhaps wasn't communicated clearly before. This course content is separated into 4 topics, but they are in many ways related, even intimately connected. How you view reality, what is real, may affect your views on free will. And how you view that topic may affect your views on what life is all about and what your moral values should be. Knowledge is, as famously described by the American philosopher W.V. Quine, is more like a web of beliefs. And when one part of that web of knowledge changes, the other parts of that web naturally changes as well. So in a way, what we're doing with this first question, what is real, is we're trying to build a scaffolding for other beliefs, because depending on what we believe is real or not, many other beliefs will either stand or fall as a result. Today we start our lectures on what is real. This is one of the most central topics in philosophy, and in covering it, we're getting a kill 2 birds with 1 stone kind of opportunity, in that we get to cover much of the history of Western philosophy as well. And today's lesson is titled Classical Answers 1, and it focuses on the pre-Socratics. But first, some clarifications. When we talk about what is real, we're asking the question, what is everything made of? We're talking about the question of being, existence, the stuff that makes up the universe. Also, we're talking about why things happen, or how things happen, the question of movement and change. We're not talking about here anything about us, not about feelings, about being authentic as opposed to being superficial. This idea of staying real or being real, that's a different meaning of what is real. None of that psychological stuff. That's for future lectures. Now we're basically talking about cosmology, or what the world is like. Here are some terms. Onto means being, or that which is or exists in Greek. So ontology is the branch of metaphysics that studies being or existence. Arche means beginning or origin or source, and we use the word to indicate the basic stuff that underlies everything in the universe. Regarding arche, one of the big questions for the pre-Socratics regarding the nature of reality was whether the arche was one or many. All the stuff that we see in the universe, the stuff we call it, is really a collection of many, many different things. There are different things in the world. There are trees, there are rocks, there are living beings like us, then there are stars. The world is composed of billions of different things, but the fundamental question of arche is, underneath those many things, the fundamental stuff that constitutes all of these things that we see, that fundamental stuff, is that one, or is that fundamental stuff composed of many things? So that is the meaning of the question when we ask, is the arche one, or is the arche many? And that is what we're going to be examining today. We begin with Thales. He is the first of the Socratics, one of the Malaysians, and also generally identified as the first philosopher by virtually everyone. As the British philosopher Bertrand Russell famously said, philosophy begins with Thales. Among his accomplishments, and apparently there were many, he predicted a solar eclipse that happened in 585 BC. And this date, 585 BC, is often given as the starting date of Western philosophy and also of science. It's an interesting observation made by scholars that Thales was also considered often the first scientist. The pre-Socratics were as much scientists as they were philosophers. They studied nature, and the study of nature is really physics. Physis, or physis, I think that's how you pronounce it in Greek, means nature. But going back to the eclipse, the reason why this date became the starting date for philosophy and of science is that it became a kind of a symbol for a change in how we view nature, from one of looking at the world as the domain of the gods, who are often capricious and in need of appeasement, to one of regular patterns of nature, patterns that we could study and understand. So the significance of Thales' prediction was that he turned this thing around. He changed the way the world was viewed, is that it made the world a predictable place, a place of science. The way we explain the world around us changed from who and why to what and how. This is the brilliance of the first Greek philosophers. We say this marks the transition from a world of superstition and ignorance to a world of rationality and reason. Consider, for example, if you ask, what is this storm, thunder, and lightning? The traditional religious Greek would say, well, that is Zeus hurling down his lightning bolts because he is angry. You see, who and why. This is often a way of disguising our ignorance. We don't know, so we say the gods. There's even a name for this. It's actually called the god of ignorance. Whereas the philosopher or the scientist would maybe make the observation it's a kind of phenomenon, a flow of energy, that is, what and how. Likewise, solar eclipse was a pattern in nature. But what makes Thales the father of philosophy, even more than this prediction of the eclipse, is his belief that everything is made up of water, that the arche, the underlying source for all reality, is water. Now, why should this be? It's easy for us in the 21st century to criticize Thales' thinking as primitive. We could say he just didn't know any better and dismiss it, but I think that would be making a mistake. Here is where we need to practice the principle of charity and try to understand why he believed that everything was made of water. The Greeks of his time believed everything was made up of 4 basic elements: earth, water, air, and fire. There were commonsensical reasons why people would believe this. Many things, be they trees, animals, or human beings, die and decompose, or things like rocks can break into smaller pieces. But it seems certain elements, namely water and air and earth and fire, don't. They never seem to break into smaller parts. They seem more elemental, fundamentally simple substances, incapable of breaking into smaller pieces, hence the 4 elements. So from observation, this particular traditional view of the particular world's composition came about. This is doxa, the appearance of things that people believed. But Thales made the break with doxa. He made a break with the way of appearance, how the world appears, and somehow reasoned his way to thinking that underneath the multiplicity, the plurality of doxa, there had to be one fundamental substance. Now, we don't really know why he thought this way. Aristotle says perhaps because Thales saw that all living things had to have water. And also, we know that water is the only element among the four that can become solid ice when cold and turn into vapor like air when hot. Aristotle also says that Thales declared the earth rested on water. So that could have been another reason why. But it's a powerful intuition that most of us have at one time or another, or entertained, that underneath the multiplicity of what we see of the world, there is something, some one substance from which everything is built. So the important point, and this is what makes Thales, this is what marks him as the first philosopher, is that he was willing to go beyond what he was seeing, willing to go beyond doxa, and reasoned his way to believing that at its most fundamental level, reality was made up of one substance. This way of thinking is what makes Thales the first philosopher. And this way of thinking is still very much alive in today's science as well, in theoretical physics, as we'll see later. Now, I would like to quickly go through the other pre-Socratics who believed that the arche was one. Anaximander was said to be a student of Thales, and he said the basic stuff of all reality was the infinite or the boundless. His idea was that anything sensory available to us through our senses could not be the arche. Now, this actually sounds incredibly prescient, like what 17th and 18th century philosophers would say over 1,000 years later, and what a lot of modern scientists would actually say reality was. But then Anaximenes, either a contemporary or a student of Anaximander, went back to identifying one of the four elements as the arche, in this case, air. Now, you can see why someone like Anaximenes would rebel against the claims of someone like Anaximander. When you hear someone say that the ultimate reality is unknowable, it kind of strikes you as nonsensical. I mean, how do you know that the ultimate reality is unknowable? You yourself are saying that it's unknowable, so how can you know what is unknowable? You're not making any sense. So you could see how someone like Anaximenes would pull away from that kind of philosophical statement and say, let's be more practical. Let's be more grounded in common sense in talking about what nature, what reality is like. This kind of tug and pull of philosophical discourse, we'll see this happen again centuries later. So this kind of thinking, this kind of tension that scholars guess was between Anaximander and Anaximenes finds echoes centuries later. And then there's Xenophanes, whom we talked about as the first philosopher of religion, is believed to have said the arche is earth. And lastly, Heraclitus said, everything is fire. And the literal interpretation of this is that he believed fire was the basic element of the arche. But many scholars choose to interpret fire of Heraclitus as metaphorical, however, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But here are two things for us to take note of briefly before moving on. One is that philosophy doesn't develop in a straight line like some other disciplines, like math, for example. Anaximander's idea of the arche is much closer to what we actually believe today about the nature of reality. Again, we'll get to that later. But Anaximenes still ends up going back to one of the four elements being the arche. So philosophical ideas often oscillate between opposing views through history, with neither side really decisively winning. The second point is that in philosophy, often students go against their teachers. It's a dialectic of going back and forth. That's what philosophy often involves. And this can be seen with Thales and Anaximander, And if the conjecture is true that Anaximander was Anaximenes' teacher, then with them as well. We'll also see this with Plato and Aristotle too. But throughout history, many philosophers and their students would have this kind of antagonistic, almost antagonistic dialectic. Heraclitus is known as the philosopher of change or of becoming. He is the last and most famous of the Ionian philosophers. He is from Ephesus. Heraclitus is a difficult philosopher to figure out, scholars say, because he made no arguments. He just made enigmatic statements, or sort of a mystic. Famous for saying paradoxical things. He said everything is fire, or that everything is in a state of flux. Here are some of his more famous sayings. He said, you can't step into the same river twice. That is probably the most famous thing he said. He also said, the only constant is change. Everything flows and nothing abides. And here's a longer quote. This world, no one of gods or men has made, but it was ever, is now, and ever shall be an ever-living fire, with measures kindling and measures going out. If you think about it, his thoughts are similar to Eastern philosophy. Think about something like the Tao or the Yin and Yang. We see all around us that everything changes. We step into a river, the water flows, so the next time we step into a different body of water. Nothing ever stays the same. We are born, we grow, and we die. All things change. Nothing lasts forever. What he says seems to be the very essence of our world, the world of doxa. That things change is trivially true. That is what doxa is all about. It's the world that we see. It changes all the time. But scholars interpret Heraclitus as being more radical here. By saying that everything changes, he is saying that, in fact, there is no such thing as an eternally unchanging element. No fundamental substance that is the root of reality. There is no stable material foundation, no arche that is the root of reality. This is why he is called the philosopher of change. Now, if this interpretation by the scholars of Heraclitus is true, that everything is in a constant state of change, and there is no fundamental element in the world to serve as its foundation, its arche, then why did he say everything is fire? Again, we don't know for sure, but the common interpretation is that he used fire only as a symbol of change. In fact, now we know that fire is not an element like atoms, hydrogen, helium, etc., but it's really a chemical reaction. You can read a short article on it if you want. I've posted a file on this on our eCampus. Now, if everything changes, absolutely everything, then is there nothing that we can hold on to? Is there nothing that can survive this ever-living fire that is our world? Is there nothing fundamentally unchanging and eternal about our world? Heraclitus said there is something that we can hold on to. He called it logos. Heraclitus spoke of and believed in something called logos, which can be translated as word or reason, which, quote, holds forever and in accordance with which all things come about. So what is this logos that he is referring to here? Some of you may recognize the word from the Bible. It's famously used to begin the Gospel of John. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. Heraclitus' use of logos seems to be something similar in meaning. For him, it's the laws that govern everything. It stands for laws or principles behind things, or a thought which steers all things. But this logos is not a substance. It's not the stuff that makes up the world. Rather, logos is the thing that governs all changes that occur in reality. So, when we say the only constant in the universe is change, still, there is that constant within which changes occur. And for Heraclitus, that constant is symbolically described as an ever-living fire, or fate, or identified as logos. Now, we should note that the world Heraclitus described is remarkably similar to what modern science says about our world. The stuff of reality, the atoms and particles, are ruled by 4 fundamental forces or fields, the physicists tell us: the laws of gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong nuclear forces. Of course, we're not saying Heraclitus knew anything about the 4 fundamental forces of the universe over thousands of years ago. But again, using the principle of charity, we are crediting him for that deep insight that all of the stuff that make up our universe, stuff that seems to always change in time, is governed by certain unchanging laws. And this argument still goes on today. Some scholars think that matter is first, that because matter exists, laws come into play. They simply describe how matter, things, interact with other things. But other scientists, and they'll often be described now as Platonists in the modern sense of that word, believe the laws exist regardless of whether there is matter or not. And these laws are eternal. But this way of viewing reality, assuming we're interpreting him correctly, was first claimed by Heraclitus. And now, finally, we come to Parmenides, arguably the most famous of the pre-Socratics. With Parmenides, we get something very different from Heraclitus. Parmenides was not one of the Ionian philosophers. Though he was likely a student of Xenophanes, scholars think, he lived in Alia, which is now part of Italy. With Parmenides, for the first time, we come to a deep logical argument, the great rationalist argument on being, which has yet to be refuted and still challenges us today. He is known as the philosopher of being because of his simple argument, which we'll get to. But first, we have to go back to that word, ontology, being. Onto includes all existing things, everything that can take on the verb to be. Either something exists or it doesn't. If it exists, then it's part of being. Anything that can be must be something or other. It cannot be just nothing. Everything that exists takes part in being. Okay, that's a simple enough concept. But because his argument of being ends up denying change, which we'll get to, Heraclitus and Parmenides are often mentioned as a contrasting pair, with Heraclitus known as the philosopher of change and Parmenides known as the philosopher of being. Parmenides' argument in a nutshell is nothing can come from nothing. Now that sounds like a normal sentence, almost a trivial thing to say. But with Parmenides, from this statement comes an incredible philosophical insight and still something that is considered controversial. Shakespeare's King Lear says it famously to his youngest daughter, Cordelia. He said, "Nothing will come of nothing." Speak again. He wants her to tell him how much she loves him so he could reward her with his kingdom's territory. And that's how the whole tragedy of King Lear starts. But the idea is something borrowed from Parmenides or the Greeks, or perhaps we should say just common sense reasoning. This is worth thinking about. To really think about. can something come from nothing? Could we ever have something like 0 plus 0 is 1? Could a 0 ever turn into a 1? We can't imagine it. Just like we can't imagine 1 plus 1 ever being anything other than 2. Reason tells us we can't get something from nothing. And if you agree with that, then Parmenides got you. His argument is made. If you look at the picture on the right, I drew this just to make this contrast. Being is what's in the center, and not being is what surrounds being there, not being or nothing. The idea is that nothing can enter or exit being. But this diagram is really misleading because just the fact that I have drawn that rectangle outside being means that rectangle exists. Real nothingness, true nothingness, doesn't exist. So there really is nothing outside being for it to either enter or exit. Being is all there is. If something existed outside being, that is also being. Anything that can be described with the verb be is part of being, you see. Now, he makes another argument that thought and being are the same, and this is a more problematic, deeply puzzling statement that he made, and we're going to skip it for now. But now, his great argument for being. Here it is in its barest form, Parmenides' argument for being. The argument itself is actually breathtakingly simple, and the conclusions from this argument constitute what is called monism today. Let us consider 1. Being is, 2. Unbeing is, 3. Both being and unbeing are. Okay, so 1. Being is, this is trivially true. We exist, the world exists, so that being is cannot be argued against. It is trivially true. 2. Unbeing is. Parmenides would say, this is patently false. According to him, unbeing or nothing cannot be. By definition, it can't exist, because whatever exists is by definition being. Therefore, unbeing is cannot be true. And if we agree that proposition 2 is false, then 3 also has to be false. Both being and unbeing are has to be false. But what is 3? To say both being and unbeing are is the same as saying becoming. This is Parmenides' argument, great argument. In other words, change. If we break this down, for something to change, truly change, it has to stop being what it was and become something it was not. That is the very definition of change. So change requires becoming. So to say 3 is false, both being and unbeing are, to say that that is false is to say that becoming or change is impossible. Okay? So then what are the consequences of such an argument? Well, here are some of the consequences. For 1, being has no beginning and no end because nothing can come from nothing. Being cannot have come from nothing. Since there was no beginning to being, it must have always existed. And since it cannot become nothing, it must always exist. Being could never turn into unbeing, because there is no such thing. There is nothing for being to turn into, therefore, being is eternal. And being cannot be divided. If there were 2 separate beings, then what comes between beings? The only thing not being is unbeing, and there is no such thing. Therefore, being has got to be a single unity without any division. And the same argument states that being cannot have any limitations, because if it were, then what limits being would be unbeing. But again, that is not possible. So being cannot be finite. It has to be infinite, and it can only be one. Now, Parmenides is not stupid. He does talk about the way of seeming, the way of doxa, where in doxa, or the world of appearance, seeming changes do happen. So he actually writes about that. He says we can observe changes in the world of appearance, the world of doxa, but those changes are not changes in being. Things seem to come into existence and go out of existence. That's the world of doxa. In reality, they all remain a part of being. Those things did not come from nothing, and they cannot turn into nothing. So the world of appearance is, at the fundamental level of being, only an illusion. But there's more. Because nothing goes out of being, what we consider the past and the future are also part of being. But this means the past never disappears, and the future already exists. I know that's linguistically confusing, but it basically means the future doesn't come into being at a certain point, because all of time exists. Let's say you did something embarrassing this morning, okay? Let's say I did something embarrassing today. I had to fart in front of my students, and I'm really embarrassed. But I say, oh, thank God, that's over and done with. But according to Parmenides, because anything that is cannot turn into something that is not, that farting event that was so embarrassing to me, that never disappears. That never becomes nothing. It continues to exist, and it exists for all eternity, for the future as well. I have no idea what I'll be doing later on today, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Everything exists because everything is part of being. And this kind of thinking is called eternalism, as opposed to presentism. And we'll have more to say about this next week when we get to Einstein. I know that the consequences of Parmenides' argument are mind-boggling and hard to accept, because it goes against common sense. But as I said, it's very difficult to refute his argument as it is, because it's such a simple argument. It's such a clear-cut argument. And if we can't refute his argument, perhaps we should say his argument is the way reality really is, that his argument really is true. Then the thing to do is to try to figure out what that means, because we do see changes all around us. As Heraclitus would say, the only constant we see is change. Time itself is defined as a kind of change. So how do we square what our senses tell us with Parmenides? Well, here's one more thing for us to think about. The law of conservation of energy. This is science. It states that the total energy of an isolated system does not change. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only undergo change of form. Note the words here. It can only undergo change of form. Change of form, what is it? It's change of appearance. Doxa. Now this is modern physics, but it sounds a lot like something Parmenides himself would say. So that's Parmenides and his argument on being. We went through pre-Socratics, who believed that underneath the world we see, the world of doxa, there is one fundamental element that is the arche, the source of all things, such as water, air, earth. We covered Heraclitus, who seems to have believed that there is no such fundamental element, but everything changes. And Logos is the only constant that governs the way the world works. But Logos is not an element, it's not an arche, it's not stuff that makes up the universe. It's rather more some kind of principle, some kind of laws. But now, faced with Parmenides and his great argument for being, how do we argue for change anymore? Well, one way of responding to Parmenides was to say there is a plurality of arche. And these philosophers who believed this about nature, about the nature of reality, they stand in contrast with the philosophers we just covered, the ones who believed the arche was one. These other philosophers believed the arche was many, and they were called the pluralists. One such pre-Socratic who advocated this view of reality was a philosopher named Empedocles. He said there are 4 root elements that are eternal. So he believed in a plurality of arche. And then he accounted for the changes that occur by saying these elements are controlled by love and strife. Love brings these elements together, and strife pulls them apart. It's really similar to the Eastern idea of yin and yang. And so it's the forces of love and strife that create movement and thus change in the universe. Now, I'm not sure if this is an adequate response to Parmenides, but it's an example of how philosophers are always trying to give an answer to challenges thrown their way by the previous generation. Before I move on to the next slide, just one interesting postscript to Empedocles. He was an interesting thinker. Scholars who study him, they say he also believed that nature had first created all sorts of weird creatures with like 6 arms or legs, 2 heads. But because they couldn't survive for long, they were all wiped out, eventually all gone. And what remained, us and the plants and animal life we see around us, that is what remained stable enough to survive. So if you read what he says, this is a kind of proto-evolutionary theory. It was brilliant and imaginative. But apparently he also believed in reincarnation, and that he himself was some kind of immortal god. So to prove that he was indeed a god, the story goes, he threw himself into a volcano on top of Mount Etna near Sicily in Italy, some island. And so that is the story of how Empedocles met his end. Another pre-Socratic who believed in plurality of arche was a man by the name of Democritus, considered by many to be the founder of atomism. Atomism was actually taught first by his teacher, a philosopher named Leucippus, but we don't know much about him, so Democritus is commonly identified as the founder of atomism. If you look at the date of his birth and death, he is actually younger than Socrates, who lived from 469 to 399 BC. But Democritus is still considered a pre-Socratic because his focus was still on nature. Whereas with Socrates, we get this turn in philosophy, where the focus in philosophy changed from nature to human beings. Now, if Parmenides was the great rationalist with his argument for being, the great argument for being, atomists like Democritus were empiricists, not to be confused with the rationalist and empiricist schools that came in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. But you could describe someone like Parmenides as a rationalist, but an atomist like Democritus as an empiricist. The atomists, they believed that there had to be some solid stuff at the basis of reality, because it didn't make sense to believe otherwise. If things could divide infinitely, then we couldn't have any kind of solid shapes, so the thinking went. So for reality to make sense, at the bottom of this division, there had to be something that could not be divided any longer, some fundamental element that could not be divided. And that they called atoms, indivisible substances. And they said those were the basic elements, the fundamental elements of reality. There is a flip side argument, which is to argue from the other end. So they say if matter is infinitely divisible, how could anything exist? Because infinity of zeros is still zeros. What does this mean? if you can have an incredibly small size atoms, let's say, but you can divide that still further, then the size ultimately will have to end up being 0. Because no matter how small the size is, if you say, okay, this is the size, but then you can still divide it in half, then that size is, I guess, still too big. So if you can divide infinitely, then ultimately you have to go to where the size is, again, 0. But then, once you get to 0, how do you come back up? It's a bit like the Parmenidean argument. You see, how can you get something out of nothing? So I don't know if this flip side argument is a logically sound argument, but it is still one of the arguments given by the atomists. Now, they also acknowledged that Parmenides' argument would admit no change. I mean, it is a solid argument, you see, the argument for being. But since we did see change in the world, that's the empiricist side, you see, we do see change. That must mean these substances had to move around. And for that to be possible, there had to be empty space between atoms. So out of necessity, the atomists believed in the existence of void, empty space, which is nothing, but had to be there to allow atoms to move around. The atomists believed in the existence of void, empty space which is nothing, but still had to be there to allow atoms to move around. Because if Parmenides was correct, then how do we explain change? It's one thing to say the world around us is deceptive, only an illusion. And that's what Democritus says as well. But it's quite a different thing to say there is no such thing as change. Again, it's the intuition of Heraclitus that everything changes. Time itself is a kind of change. So if Parmenides is right, then how do we explain the existence of change? Even being deceived required some kind of change, right? How could you be deceived if nothing changes? Hence, the void. Now we could argue, since there is nothing in the void really is nothing. So, atomism says only atoms and void are real for the atomists. This is called reductionism now. Democritus says, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, hot and cold and color, but in reality, atoms and void. For example, he would say honey tastes sweet, but sweet exists only in our mind. Even the object honey doesn't exist. Democritus's atomism was rejected by Plato and Aristotle, but it became fashionable again with Epicurus and Epicureanism, which we'll get to way later on with the topic of free will. But then atomism was forgotten again because Aristotelian ideas took over, and it wasn't until the 17th century, with the rise of modern science, that it was revived. And then once it was revived, atomism basically took over the scientific world. And atomism, I suppose, is in a way still the theory to beat, in the popular consciousness anyway, the theory that the basic stuff of reality is made up of atoms. Okay then, that was a brief survey, scattered survey of the pre-Socratics and what their view of reality was. Next time, we will tackle Plato and Aristotle, as I said, who rejected atomism, and we'll see what they believed was the stuff of reality. Thank you for listening.